Hi, this is Bill, and today's topic is the United States and civilizational decline. And I believe there's certainly two major concerns for why I believe it most likely is. The first one has to do with the national debt, which is over $35 trillion. And the second one has to do with the amount of money we're spending on healthcare, which is like 17% of GDP. So on the healthcare front, if you compare our spending compared to other industrialized countries of Europe, Canada, and Japan that have socialized healthcare, their spending is like in the 10 to 12%. So we're way in excess of those countries. And then just China at 5%. And before you kind of dismiss China as being not relevant, in the 1950s, apparently the United States was only spending 5% of its GDP on healthcare back then. And then it kind of slowly crept up to about 6% in the 1960s, and this was when government began Medicare and Medicaid. And then basically since then, the healthcare spending has been growing at a rate of about 2% faster than the GDP rate has from that point on, to the astronomical numbers become today. And the reason why I see this as a problem is because it's not terribly productive spending. In other words, I would say not really wealth creating. So it's, unfortunately, I know it's going to be callous, but it is probably kind of a drag on the U.S. economy. And here's basically a metaphor that happened, that I think kind of describes what's going on here. I went out to Texas last week to visit my niece and husband for Thanksgiving, and they had a cat at the vet. And 3 days later, he comes home with a dead cat and a $5,700 vet bill. And it's kind of funny being on the outside of this, but it's really very tragic in reality. But the reality is that a lot of this health care that we're spending this money on is on old people with chronic conditions for which health outcomes are just abysmally poor. I mean, this is just a fact. So, in the end of the day, you've got a lot of procedures, treatment, hospitals involved in palliative care for a lot of the population, and they end up dying anyway. Then you got $1 million bill that basically the taxpayers have to foot. So I have my opinions on what I think is a problem here. Certainly, the first problem is that when the government got involved in covering healthcare costs, in essence, now you've got a deep pocket for the healthcare industry to start digging into and exploiting. But the other side of the problem is that for some reason, I guess it's probably coming from the AMA, they want to ration how much supply there can be, so that way there's never any fear of a doctor facing unemployment. And so therefore, there's nothing to stop the costs from going up. I mean, the tried and true things like the thing the Fed's doing, which is to raise interest rates with the specific goal of trying to drive up unemployment, which then of course tends to drive down wages and demand, which of course should suppress inflation. Basically unemployment then means there's now labor competition for jobs, and so therefore employers don't have to pay as much money, and of course unemployed people aren't going to be buying things at the same rate as an employed person does. So in other words, all this stuff tends to suppress inflation, and that's the tool the Fed uses. But none of this works on the medical side because the AMA is making sure that we don't have too many doctors or other healthcare professionals, so that way these people never fear unemployment. So this is an addressable problem, but again, it takes political will to do so. Okay, let's move on to the national debt. I believe it's like $35.7 trillion. Our GDP is about 27.4 or something like that. So we're looking at a debt now that's 1.3 times bigger than the GDP. the percent of government spending that's used to service the interest on this debt is about 14%, according to an internet search, which is, I mean, I don't know if is that a problem or not. I guess I can't academically debate this one way or the other, but here's something at least to think of, is that if you're going to go buy a house, the lender usually doesn't want to loan you more than what the payment would amount to, maybe 33% of your income. In other words, that's going to be your mortgage payment to the lender. They won't lend you more because I guess from experience they know that lending more brings too much default risk. So right now you've got a federal government we're now up to 14%. So I guess it's not 33%, but unlike a mortgage loan where it's kind of a one and done thing, you know, the loan goes out. If you got a fixed rate, you know, there's potential that your income can increase, and so that percentage will go down in time. And there's probably a good likelihood they're going to get that money back with the interest they want. You know, yeah. I guess this works out for their risk-reward balance sort of thing. Federal government, on the other hand, is sort of got a HELOC situation, you know, where they're borrowing more each and every year. So, you know, 14% this year will probably be 15, 16 next year. Who knows? It's going to keep going up, and it's kind of in a positive feedback sort of thing. So, you know, if it gets up to 33, I mean, if it's like a household type thing, if it gets up to 33%, then you go into real danger of default beyond that. And there's nothing, you know, unless you know, a straight out loan, which is a one and done thing with the federal government, it just keeps growing all the time. And if we get to the point where it is 33%, what's going to stop it from becoming 37%? You know, because they're basically borrowing money to pay for the money they've already borrowed. So here's the disconcerting thing about all this is that I've listened to a number of these economists talk. You know, Tom Bill Yu has a impact theory channel he brings a number of these guys on, and they're all saying the same thing, that the only chance we have of getting out of this problem is for what we'll need is like spectacular GDP growth, disruptive technologies that create a tremendous amount of wealth, and you know, relying on the private sector to do this it's probably the only hope, but unfortunately it's going to be risky. I mean, it's sort of like if you're training to excel in some sport, you know, your ability to improve and get better is never guaranteed, you know, no matter how hard you may work at it. And you know, we're really kind of in the same situation. I mean, hopefully maybe AI and robotics will save the day. This Mark Andreessen, who was on Tom's show, you know, basically talks about this, and he says pretty much that's our only chance. And he probably is right. So the other side to this is, okay, what if you say, let's just grow government to infinity and let government solve the problem? And you know, again, listen to these guys. They make a very good point here. Is that that's almost certainly not going to work, and this is the reason why. I mean, it is not intended to be politically biased or anything. It's just kind of a fact of history and stuff like that. Is that governments tend to work in what you may call a zero-sum game world. You know, it's take money from here, put it over there, take it from this person, give it to that person. You know, it's not terribly disruptive technologically speaking or wealth creating. In fact, the only time governments really create a lot of wealth, unfortunately, is through massive wars where they could destroy their economic competitors. Kind of like what happened during the Second World War with the United States, you know, against the Axis powers. So yeah. So yeah, if you're going to rely on growing the government to infinity and relying on it to solve this problem, even though it's a problem it basically has created, is almost guaranteed to fail because of the zero-sum game aspect of it. And here's another problem which makes this even worse, is that this zero-sum game is almost always cloaked with this guaranteed equality of outcome. Strings attached to to this approach. So not only are we using a method that is almost certainly not going to create disruptive technological growth, we're even going to suppress excellence within that by this guarantee of quality of outcome. And now, if you don't believe me, we've had this experiment done already. It's called the Soviet Union. A communist system. I mean, here's a country that really, by all practical purposes, should have succeeded very well because, it's a big country, had tons of natural resources, had a top-notch military, so there was never any threat it was going to ever get invaded by anybody. And, I mean, and here's an example of the government, and of course it had a pretty good sized population too, which is good because it allowed it to take advantage of full economic specialization, if you will. In other words, they had enough people that they could have people that specialize in electronics or people that specialize in farming, and you didn't, if you have a small population, people have to become more generalists, so they don't necessarily become great at any one thing. But the Soviet Union had a big enough population. I think it was similar to the United States, but they could take full advantage of economic specialization. So I was talking to someone at the park about this. I mean, this has to be a total example of an economic, a total failure of economic policy and political execution. I mean, in a sense, it was exactly what happens when you have basically a zero-sum game environment with a guarantee of quality of outcome, because the Soviet Union basically told people what to do. Everyone was supposed to be equal in the system, and I think a vast majority of the population pretty much was in terms of what they got paid. And therefore, I mean, I guess this is the core of what communism is about. It's a commune basically, where everyone contributes to to the cause of the state, and the state supposedly distributes all of its wealth and resources equitably. So, and by the way, I will say this: China has learned from that mistake. They definitely do not practice guaranteed equality of outcome there. I think they have I think they are practicing the communism, government tyranny and authoritarianism, but certainly they are allowing private ownership, business competition, and a whole bit. So they're adopting a lot of what happens here. And they're certainly doing well. So, so we're really in a rock and a hard place. You've got one route to go, which is to say, okay, let's just grow the government infinity and let it solve the problem, which I think is guaranteed to absolutely fail, for the reasons I've said. And then the other one is, okay, let's see what the private sector can come up with. And I bet this is risky. I mean, hopefully the private sector is talented and creative enough to grow our GDP substantially, which is what people say is going to be needed for us to get out of this debt. I don't know what substantially means, but you're probably looking at least doubling or tripling. I mean, a point where the debt may be only half or a smaller fraction of the GDP. So anyway, those are my thoughts. As I said, I'd like to hear your comment on this. And good night.